The winter of 1942 stretched across the Eastern Front like a frozen battlefield of despair, covering every road, every river, and every forest in a thick layer of ice and snow. Moscow's high command had meticulously plotted their next offensive for months, confident that every calculation, every division placement, every tank movement would deliver an unstoppable strike against the German army. Maps were sprawled across the long tables of the Stavka, colored pins marking Soviet divisions, artillery ranges, and supply lines. On paper, it was perfect. On paper, it should have worked. Marshal Zhukov, the iron-willed commander who had led the Red Army through some of its most daring operations, moved deliberately around the table, eyes scanning the strategic map with intensity. "Our forces will encircle the enemy," he declared. "Tanks, infantry, and artillery will operate in perfect coordination. Air support will dominate the skies. Victory will be ours if we execute this plan flawlessly." Around him, generals nodded, some with confidence, some masking unease behind their faces. They had spent weeks analyzing intelligence, tracking German troop movements, studying supply lines, and predicting enemy countermeasures. They believed every scenario had been considered. They believed the Germans could not escape their trap. Across the snow-covered plains, Soviet troops readied themselves. T-34 tanks rumbled down frozen roads, engines growling against the Arctic wind, exhaust fogging in the frigid air. Infantry marched in strict formations, rifles ready, bayonets gleaming, boots sinking into thick snow. Soldiers wrapped in layers of winter clothing moved with grim determination, their faces pale from frostbite, their breaths frozen in the cold morning air. Colonel Petrov observed silently from the edge of the column. "They do not know what is coming," he muttered. "All this planning, it does not account for the chaos of real war." High above, reconnaissance planes scanned German positions, noting artillery emplacements, troop concentrations, and defensive fortifications. Reports poured back to Moscow, where officers recalculated movements and adjusted supply schedules with the confidence of men who believed they had anticipated every move. Yet the Germans had been watching too. They had intercepted communications, studied Soviet mobilization patterns, and anticipated the offensive with terrifying precision. For every Soviet move, there was a German counter. Every plan had a flaw the enemy would exploit. At dawn, the offensive began. Snow drifted over frozen plains as Soviet artillery unleashed a thunderous barrage, shaking the ground and sending plumes of ice and snow high into the air. Infantry advanced, followed by tanks roaring across the terrain, their treads cutting deep trenches into the snow. For a moment, it seemed as though the plan had worked. German bunkers collapsed, machine guns fell silent, and soldiers shouted in triumph. They believed the perfect plan had led them to victory. Then the Germans struck back. Artillery positioned further than Soviet intelligence had ever estimated opened fire from unexpected angles. Pincer movements began to encircle advancing Soviet units, cutting them off from supply lines and destroying communications. Tanks were ambushed and destroyed. Entire battalions were trapped and isolated, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. In the command tents, officers scrambled over maps and reports. "Supply lines destroyed!" one shouted. Marshal Zhukov slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing across the room. Every pin, every line, every carefully calculated movement now represented chaos. Reports arrived faster than they could be processed, divisions surrounded, tanks obliterated, air support delayed or shot down. Months of careful planning were unraveling in hours. The generals exchanged grim, haunted looks. One whispered, barely audible, "Our entire strategy, it's failing. Total failure." On the front lines, Soviet soldiers fought valiantly. T-34s charged German positions, infantry lobbed grenades into pillboxes, snipers targeted officers, but the Germans were always a step ahead. What was intended as an unstoppable offensive had become a desperate struggle to survive. Above, the Luftwaffe strafed supply lines and reinforced German positions. Soviet reconnaissance planes were destroyed, leaving soldiers blind and isolated. Moscow's high command trembled as the true scale of the disaster became clear. Entire divisions lost. supply convoys destroyed. German counteroffensive spreading. Marshal Zhukov and his generals had believed in the perfection of their plan, but now they faced a horrifying reality. The entire Soviet strategy had failed, leaving the army vulnerable, the soldiers bleeding, and the high command reeling in disbelief. The winter of 1942 had not only frozen the land but frozen the hopes of victory in its icy grip. The grand strategy, once the pride of the Soviet Union, had crumbled before it even reached full execution, and the costs would be measured in blood, fire, and the unyielding cold of the Eastern Front. By midday, the illusion of control that had dominated Moscow's command halls began to crumble. The Soviet offensive, once meticulously coordinated and hailed as unstoppable, had turned into a maelstrom of confusion and desperation. Reports from the front lines arrived in waves, each more alarming than the last. Entire divisions that had been expected to hold their positions were trapped or scattered. Tanks that were supposed to lead assaults lay destroyed in icy craters, pierced by German anti-tank rounds that had been hidden in gullies and forest edges, where Soviet intelligence had not predicted. The winter wind cut across the Eastern Front like a blade, whipping up clouds of snow that stung exposed faces and coated gun barrels in ice. Soviet soldiers advanced with determination, but each step forward was met with deadly precision. German artillery rained destruction from unexpected positions. Mortars, machine guns, and concealed riflemen tore through advancing infantry. Tanks attempting to flank enemy positions were forced into frozen marshes or ambushed along narrow roads, where German panzer divisions lay in wait. The carefully orchestrated rhythm of the Soviet advance was replaced by a desperate scramble for survival, every unit operating in isolation, disconnected from headquarters and unaware of the positions of neighboring formations. Colonel Petrov, who had been stationed at a forward command post, looked over the shattered remains of his unit. Snow clung to the jagged edges of destroyed tanks. Bodies lay frozen where they had fallen. The cries of wounded men echoed across the plains, barely audible over the continuous roar of artillery and the rattle of machine guns. "This is not what we planned," he muttered to his aide, his voice barely above the wind. "We are walking into hell, and the High Command does not see it yet." Air support, meant to provide cover and suppress German positions, was delayed or misdirected. The Luftwaffe had already established air superiority, launching precise bombing runs on supply lines and artillery positions. Soviet reconnaissance planes were intercepted or destroyed, leaving ground commanders blind, forced to rely on outdated maps and fragmented communications. Without eyes in the sky, every advance became a gamble. Soldiers moving into what should have been lightly defended areas were suddenly caught in the crossfire of well-prepared German defenses. In Moscow, High Command watched with growing horror as reports painted a picture of total disarray. Marshal Zhukov studied the incoming messages, his face grim, his mind racing. For weeks, he had believed in the precision of his calculations, the thoroughness of his intelligence, and the bravery of his men. But now, he realized that every assumption had been wrong. The Germans had anticipated movements, hidden reserves had been deployed at critical junctures, and counterattacks had shattered formations that were supposed to remain cohesive. The carefully plotted map of the offensive had become a mosaic of chaos and blood. Generals whispered frantically, attempting to interpret reports that seemed increasingly contradictory. One officer's hands shook as he pointed to a map, indicating entire battalions lost to encirclement. Another reported that artillery had been destroyed or misfired, leaving infantry exposed. Supply lines were cut, reinforcements blocked, and retreat routes compromised. The panic that spread through the Stavka mirrored the confusion of the soldiers on the ground. Every hour that passed brought new reports of collapse, and the High Command was powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, on the frozen plains, the fighting intensified. Soviet tanks, isolated and outnumbered, attempted to regroup and strike at German positions but were quickly overwhelmed by well-coordinated counterattacks. Infantry units that had been ordered to advance found themselves surrounded, forced to dig trenches in snow and ice to survive. Commanders shouted orders that could not reach distant units, radios smashed or jammed by German interference. Morale began to crumble as soldiers realized that the carefully constructed offensive had been reduced to a desperate battle for survival, each man and machine fighting alone against a relentless, adaptive enemy. The Luftwaffe struck again, strafing supply depots and immobilized tanks, forcing retreating units to abandon precious resources. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies that had been stockpiled for the offensive were either destroyed or captured. Communications lines were severed, leaving commanders to make decisions based on fragmentary and often inaccurate intelligence. Each decision carried the weight of life and death, and the consequences of error were immediate and fatal. Marshal Zhukov and his generals could only watch as the reports accumulated, their faces pale, the reality of failure sinking in with every message. The offensive, conceived as the pinnacle of Soviet planning, had become a catastrophe. Entire divisions were surrounded or destroyed. Tank brigades had been decimated. Supply chains obliterated. Air support neutralized. The Germans, far from being overwhelmed, were exploiting every weakness, striking with ruthless efficiency. By nightfall, the once pristine front lines were shattered. Snow-covered plains were littered with wrecked vehicles, frozen corpses, and the remnants of what had been an ambitious plan of encirclement. Marshal Zhukov stared at the reports and maps, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like the bitter winter itself. The Soviet High Command had believed they were orchestrating a flawless victory, but the cold, unforgiving reality of the Eastern Front had proven them catastrophically wrong. The soldiers, struggling to survive amid the chaos, understood only partially what had happened. Orders no longer flowed, positions were lost, and hope became a distant memory. In Moscow, High Command grappled with the unimaginable. Their entire strategy, painstakingly designed and seemingly perfect, had collapsed within hours, leaving a trail of destruction, death, and humiliation across the frozen expanse of the Eastern Front. The horror of total failure had taken hold, and there would be no simple path to redemption. As the second day of the offensive unfolded, the cracks in the Soviet plan widened into chasms of catastrophe. Reports from the front lines arrived in frantic bursts, each more devastating than the last. Entire divisions had been isolated, surrounded by German pincer movements that exploited every weakness in the Soviet advance. Tanks that had once rolled forward with confidence now lay smoking and destroyed in frozen craters, twisted by anti-tank fire that had come from positions no intelligence officer had predicted. Infantry, cut off from reinforcements and artillery support, dug trenches in the snow, attempting to survive against relentless attacks. Morale plummeted as the realization spread. The offensive was failing, and the soldiers themselves were the first to sense the enormity of the disaster. Marshal Zhukov convened a hurried meeting at the Stavka. Maps and reports were scattered across the long tables, each representing a piece of the disaster. Generals leaned over them, faces pale, eyes scanning the positions of units that no longer existed, roads that had become death traps, and supply lines obliterated by German strikes. "The Germans anticipated our every move," Zhukov said, his voice steady but low, the weight of responsibility heavy in his tone. "They have exploited every miscalculation. We are losing entire divisions before we can even respond." Across the snow-laden plains, chaos reigned. Soviet tanks attempted desperate maneuvers to regroup, only to be funneled into ambushes expertly prepared by German commanders. T-34s rolled through snowdrifts only to be met by hidden panzer units, shells tearing through armor with deadly precision. Infantry units, separated from their support, attempted to hold strategic points, only to be overrun by concentrated German fire. Communication lines were severed, radios destroyed, leaving commanders isolated and unable to coordinate with other units. Orders became meaningless as the reality on the ground defied every prediction. Colonel Petrov moved among the surviving troops, his breath freezing in the bitter wind. He saw men huddled in trenches, faces streaked with blood and frostbite, their eyes hollow from exhaustion and terror. "Stay with me!" he shouted, though the words felt hollow even as they left his lips. Soldiers nodded, clutching rifles, knowing that their survival depended on their own wits as much as on any strategy devised in Moscow. Every movement was calculated in seconds, every action a gamble, every misstep potentially fatal. The German forces, exploiting their superior positioning and knowledge of the terrain, moved like predators through the chaos, striking with precision and withdrawing before the Soviets could respond. Air support, meant to alleviate the pressure on the ground, had been neutralized almost entirely. The Luftwaffe patrolled the skies with impunity, launching bombing raids on supply depots and artillery positions while intercepting reconnaissance planes. Without aerial observation, ground commanders were effectively blind. Soviet tanks advanced blindly into ambushes. Infantry units marched into kill zones with no knowledge of enemy placement. Even when Soviet aircraft did manage to engage, the coordinated German air defense ensured heavy losses, further demoralizing the troops below. In the Stavka, the reports were relentless. "The 12th Tank Brigade destroyed," one officer said, pointing to a map. "The 45th Infantry Division surrounded and out of communication," another added. Every minute brought new figures of loss, fresh indications that the strategy, so painstakingly crafted, had failed utterly. Generals murmured excuses, blaming weather, terrain, or miscommunication, but Zhukov knew the truth: the Germans had outmaneuvered them at every turn. The failure was total. Back on the front, isolated Soviet units attempted to fight their way back to friendly lines. T-34 crews fired at targets they could not see, infantrymen scrambled over frozen earth seeking cover that barely existed, and snipers targeted any movement from the enemy, knowing it could be their last chance. Yet for every action, the Germans responded with brutal efficiency, striking from unexpected directions, exploiting mistakes, and using every tactical advantage. The battlefield had become a labyrinth of death, confusion, and snow, with soldiers fighting not for victory, but simply to survive another hour. Even the most seasoned officers began to doubt their own calculations. They had relied on intelligence reports, maps, and assumptions that had proven fatally wrong. Entire units were lost without ever engaging the enemy effectively. Supplies, food, and ammunition were trapped or destroyed. Retreat, when possible, was hampered by the frozen terrain and enemy positioning. Panic was spreading among troops who had been trained to trust the plan, but the plan no longer existed. It had been obliterated by superior German tactics, misjudged terrain, and the unforgiving reality of winter warfare. By evening, the extent of the disaster became undeniable. Snowfields that had seemed pristine and untouched were now littered with the wreckage of Soviet machinery, the frozen bodies of men who had fallen without backup, and the debris of what was supposed to be a decisive offensive. Marshal Zhukov and his generals, once confident in the brilliance of their strategy, now stared at the reports in disbelief. The plan had failed catastrophically, leaving the Red Army exposed and bloodied, the soldiers fighting desperately against an enemy they had been told would crumble. The High Command had underestimated the Germans, overestimated their own control, and paid the price in human lives and lost territory. Across the Eastern Front, the Soviet army struggled to regroup, but the momentum of the offensive had been destroyed. The carefully crafted strategy, meant to deliver a swift and decisive blow, had disintegrated into chaos, leaving only devastation and the cold, unforgiving winter that seemed to mock the failures of men. The horror was clear: the entire plan, every calculation and prediction, had failed, and the full scale of the catastrophe would be felt for weeks, if not months, as the Soviets scrambled to salvage what remained of their forces. By the fourth day of the offensive, the illusion of control had completely vanished. What had begun as a meticulously planned strike now resembled a desperate, chaotic retreat across the snow-covered plains of the Eastern Front. Entire Soviet formations were disintegrating under constant German pressure. Tanks lay abandoned in frozen ditches, engines cold and silent. Infantry units were scattered, some surrounded and cut off, others trapped in defensive pockets with little hope of escape. Communications had collapsed entirely, radios were destroyed or jammed, and orders from High Command could not reach the front lines. Soldiers were forced to improvise, relying on instinct and courage alone to survive. Marshal Zhukov and the Stavka generals watched in horror as reports of catastrophic losses poured in from every sector. The offensive, conceived as the crowning achievement of Soviet strategy, had become a nightmare of disorganization and bloodshed. Maps that once represented careful calculations and control now displayed a chaotic mosaic of encircled units, destroyed tanks, and broken supply lines. "We cannot hold them," muttered one officer, voice trembling with disbelief. "Entire divisions are trapped. We cannot reinforce them. They are lost." Across the plains, the retreat was slow, exhausting, and deadly. Soldiers marched through deep snow under constant threat from German machine guns, mortars, and snipers. Frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion took as many victims as enemy fire. Tanks attempted to maneuver along frozen roads, only to be ambushed or bogged down in ice and snowdrifts. Artillery units, meant to provide cover, were immobilized or destroyed, leaving infantry vulnerable. What had been an offensive intended to deliver a crushing blow now felt like a desperate flight from annihilation. Colonel Petrov moved among his surviving men, trying to maintain order in the chaos. He saw exhaustion and terror etched on every face, men who had once believed in the brilliance of the High Command's plan now fighting simply to stay alive. "Keep moving!" he shouted over the roar of artillery and the rattle of machine guns. "Do not stop! Every step forward is a step toward survival." But even his words could not mask the futility of the situation. Soldiers collapsed in the snow, their hands frozen to weapons, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Above the battlefield, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies. German fighters swooped down, strafing retreating Soviet columns and targeting immobilized tanks. Bombers destroyed supply convoys before they could reach the front, cutting off desperately needed food, ammunition, and medical aid. Soviet aircraft attempted to intervene, but with airfields under constant attack and planes scattered or destroyed, their efforts were limited and largely ineffective. The skies that had once promised support now only added terror to the soldiers below. In Moscow, High Command was paralyzed. Officers pored over fragmented reports, maps that no longer corresponded to reality, and messages that contradicted each other. Marshal Zhukov's face was grim, lined with exhaustion and anger. Every calculation had failed. Every prediction had been wrong. The Germans had anticipated the Soviet moves, used the terrain to their advantage, and executed counterattacks with devastating precision. The plan that was supposed to secure victory had instead brought humiliation, destruction, and despair. Supply lines, already strained, were completely severed. Reinforcements could not reach isolated units. Artillery ammunition ran low, and medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded soldiers froze where they fell, unreachable by comrades or medics. Morale, which had once been strong, disintegrated under the constant pressure of enemy attacks and the realization that their commanders had miscalculated on every level. Even where Soviet forces attempted to hold positions, they were gradually pushed back. Villages that had been designated as defensive points were overrun. Forests that were meant to provide cover became traps as German forces flanked and encircled retreating units. Tanks, forced to abandon frozen roads, became easy targets. Infantrymen huddled in trenches under relentless artillery fire, watching comrades fall one by one. The battlefield had become a frozen nightmare, every step forward or backward marked by death and destruction. Marshal Zhukov and his generals struggled to respond. Orders were given and counter-orders issued, but the chaos was too great. Communications could not reach isolated units, and even when messages arrived, the situation had already changed. The offensive that was supposed to secure Soviet dominance had turned into a frantic effort to contain disaster. Every hour brought new reports of destruction and encirclement. Every minute added to the growing realization that the High Command's strategy had failed completely. By nightfall, the retreat had reached its apex. Snowfields were littered with destroyed tanks, abandoned artillery, and frozen bodies. The German forces, having exploited every weakness, maintained relentless pressure, allowing no respite. Marshal Zhukov and his generals faced the unthinkable. The carefully calculated Soviet strategy had collapsed entirely. Months of planning, years of preparation, and the sacrifices of countless soldiers had been reduced to chaos and blood on the frozen plains. The High Command had been horrified, and the soldiers bore the full weight of that failure as the winter of 1942 pressed down on them mercilessly, leaving the Red Army battered, broken, and struggling to survive. The fifth day of the offensive brought the Soviets face to face with the full consequences of their strategic collapse. What had begun as an ambitious plan to encircle the German forces now lay in ruins. Soviet units, already battered and disorganized, were relentlessly pursued by German divisions who had seized the initiative and refused to relent. Every river crossing, every frozen road, every village that could have offered cover was transformed into a killing ground by expertly positioned German troops. The advance of the Red Army had been halted, not by lack of courage or equipment, but by the brilliance and ruthlessness of the enemy. Marshal Zhukov's offices in Moscow were filled with the tense hum of officers trying to piece together an understanding of the catastrophe unfolding on the front. Reports arrived in fragments, often contradictory, detailing isolated units surrounded by superior forces, supply columns destroyed, and artillery brigades immobilized in snowdrifts or obliterated under precise German fire. Entire divisions trapped beyond repair, one officer said grimly, slamming a map down onto the table. Reinforcements cannot reach them. Communications are shattered. This is total failure. Across the frozen plains, Soviet soldiers struggled to survive. Tanks, once symbols of power and mobility, were now burned out hulks frozen in ice and snow, abandoned after crews were either killed or forced to flee. Infantry units moved through villages reduced to rubble, huddling behind walls shattered by German artillery. Morale, already fragile, was shattered entirely as soldiers realized that the meticulously planned offensive had become a desperate bid to escape annihilation. Every step forward carried the threat of ambush. Every moment of pause risked encirclement. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. German fighters strafed retreating columns, while bombers destroyed supply caches and artillery positions. Soviet aircraft, scattered and outnumbered, attempted to intervene but were quickly shot down or forced to retreat. Without air cover, every movement on the ground was observed, targeted, and exploited. Soldiers moving to aid comrades found themselves under fire from the skies as well as the earth. The once coordinated Soviet strategy had collapsed entirely under the twin pressures of German firepower and the unforgiving winter. High command in Moscow watched helplessly as the German counteroffensive spread. Every report highlighted the same brutal truth: Soviet forces were being destroyed systematically. Entire brigades had been cut off, surrounded in frozen forests and marshlands, forced to surrender or be annihilated. Artillery positions were neutralized, rendering infantry even more vulnerable. Supply lines had been severed, leaving soldiers without food, ammunition, or medical care. Communications were chaotic at best, non-existent at worst, and every attempt to restore order was thwarted by the fluid and merciless German advance. Colonel Petrov and his remaining forces attempted to establish a defensive line near a small village. Trenches were hastily dug, machine guns placed at choke points, and signals sent to higher command for reinforcements that would never arrive. Soldiers froze in their positions, their breaths misting in the icy wind, their fingers numb and clumsy with frostbite. Every gunshot, every shell, every explosion reminded them that the grand strategy of the Soviet High Command had failed utterly. Even those who survived the first wave of attacks knew that survival alone was no victory. On the battlefield, the Germans pressed their advantage mercilessly. Panzer divisions struck with precision, enveloping retreating Soviet columns, while infantry cut off escape routes through frozen forests. Artillery pounded isolated positions with devastating accuracy. Supply convoys attempting to bring ammunition or reinforcements were ambushed and destroyed, leaving survivors to scavenge from the fallen. The Red Army was no longer advancing, it was fighting merely to survive. Back in Moscow, the Stavka could only watch the reports unfold like a grim tapestry of disaster. Marshal Zhukov, normally the embodiment of calm and control, felt the full weight of responsibility crushing down. Every calculation, every prediction, every assumption had been fatally flawed. The Germans had adapted, exploited, and annihilated the units they had studied for months. Every division lost, every tank destroyed, every supply line severed was a testament to the failure of the plan and the horror of misjudgment. By nightfall, the scale of destruction was horrifying. Villages along the front were reduced to frozen ruins. Snow-covered fields were littered with destroyed tanks, abandoned artillery, and the bodies of soldiers who had fallen without support. The retreating forces had left behind everything they could not carry, their survival dependent on speed, courage, and luck. The Soviets had expected victory, a decisive blow that would crush the Germans, but they had been met with annihilation instead. The High Command was left with only the bitter knowledge that their strategy, the plan that had been celebrated as infallible, had collapsed. The blood of thousands of soldiers, the destruction of machinery, and the shattered morale of an entire army bore witness to a truth no one could ignore. The Soviet offensive had failed utterly, and the consequences would be felt across the Eastern Front for months to come. The horror of complete strategic failure had taken hold, and the Red Army would struggle to recover from this blow while the Germans pressed their advantage relentlessly, demonstrating with chilling efficiency how quickly meticulous plans could turn to ashes when confronted with an adaptive and ruthless enemy. By the sixth day, the Eastern Front bore the scars of the disastrous Soviet offensive. Snow-covered plains, once pristine, were littered with wrecked tanks, shattered artillery, and the frozen bodies of soldiers who had fallen without reinforcements. Entire divisions that had been planned as the spearhead of a crushing blow were reduced to fragmented units, struggling to retreat or regroup under relentless German pressure. The German counteroffensive had exploited every weakness, cutting off supply lines, destroying communications, and systematically annihilating units that had been trained and equipped for coordinated action. What had begun as a meticulously calculated plan had now become a cautionary tale of misjudgment, overconfidence, and the unforgiving reality of winter warfare. Marshal Zhukov sat in the Stavka, staring at the maps before him. The pins marking Soviet divisions were no longer symbols of strategy but markers of catastrophe. Each report, each casualty count, each description of lost equipment brought a new layer of horror. Entire tank brigades had been destroyed, supply columns obliterated, and infantry units annihilated or encircled. Communications were intermittent, orders impossible to enforce, and morale was shattered across the front. High-ranking generals whispered among themselves, faces pale, trying to find solutions, but every calculation failed to account for the chaos that now dominated the battlefield. On the frozen plains, surviving Soviet units moved cautiously, attempting to salvage what remained of their forces. Soldiers trudged through deep snow, exhausted, hungry, and freezing, their breaths misting in the icy wind. Tanks that were still operational moved in isolated pockets, often outnumbered and outflanked. Infantrymen carried wounded comrades over frozen ground, improvising with what limited medical supplies remained. Every movement was a gamble, every encounter potentially deadly. What had been intended as an offensive designed to secure victory had become a desperate struggle simply to survive another hour. The Luftwaffe continued to dominate the skies, ensuring that every Soviet maneuver was observed, targeted, and exploited. Bombing raids destroyed artillery positions and supply depots, while fighter patrols strafed retreating columns. Soviet air support was sparse and ineffective, with planes scattered or destroyed, leaving ground units exposed. Even reconnaissance flights were intercepted or shot down, leaving commanders blind to the shifting battlefield. The advantage that had once been expected to belong to the Soviets had evaporated completely, leaving them vulnerable in every direction. Colonel Petrov, moving among the survivors, saw men shaking from cold, exhaustion, and fear. Their weapons were frost-covered, their eyes hollow, their hands numb. "Keep moving!" he shouted, though the words barely penetrated the roar of distant artillery. Soldiers responded with quiet obedience, moving as best they could, aware that hesitation could mean death. Every step was a risk, every snow-covered field a potential trap. The carefully designed Soviet strategy had disintegrated into chaos, leaving the men to fight not for victory, but simply to survive. In Moscow, the Stavka faced the grim task of evaluating the disaster. Reports of encircled units, destroyed divisions, and lost equipment arrived faster than they could be processed. Marshal Zhukov and his generals, who had once believed in the infallibility of their plan, now understood that the entire offensive had failed. Every calculation had been wrong. Every assumption had been exploited by a determined, adaptive enemy. The High Command had underestimated the Germans, overestimated the capabilities of their own forces, and paid a staggering price in blood, morale, and lost resources. The retreat of the Red Army was conducted under constant pressure. Villages and towns that could have served as defensive positions had been destroyed or were already occupied by German forces. Roads were blocked with wrecked vehicles, making movement slow and treacherous. Units were scattered, forced to improvise defensive lines or dig into snow-covered terrain for temporary protection. Commanders attempted to regroup and salvage what remained of their forces, but the cohesion of the army had been shattered. Even those who survived the immediate battles faced long-term consequences. Morale was fractured, trust in leadership weakened, and the knowledge of total strategic failure weighed heavily on soldiers and commanders alike. The winter of 1942 would be remembered not as a season of Soviet triumph, but as a period when the entire High Command had miscalculated, and the army paid the price in blood, fire, and frozen earth. By the end of the week, the Eastern Front had transformed. The carefully planned Soviet offensive was no longer a coordinated assault but a series of desperate retreats, small defensive actions, and attempts to regroup under overwhelming German pressure. Marshal Zhukov and his generals faced the terrifying realization that months of planning, years of preparation, and countless sacrifices had culminated in one of the most catastrophic failures of the war. The Soviet High Command had been horrified, the soldiers devastated, and the Germans triumphant in exploiting every flaw. The lesson of the offensive was brutal and unforgiving. In war, meticulous plans can collapse in hours, leaving devastation, chaos, and horror in their wake.